Hello, thank you for visiting. Today, I want to tell you a story. A case that seems like it only happens in a horror movie but is actually a real-life obsession. The story begins in San Juan, Puerto Rico in the spring of 2021, a story of ambition, love, and a growing darkness beneath the surface. I want you to imagine the sun rising over the city as the headlines suddenly turn from admiration to horror. That's when the name Keishla Rodríguez Ortiz becomes a national and international tragedy, and Felix Verdejo, once the golden boy of Puerto Rico's boxing ring, is swept up in a headline that no one can understand. Felix was once one of the island's most promising athletes. Born in May 1993, he has surpassed all expectations. A quarter-finalist at the 2012 London Olympics, a knockout dubbed Diamond. He has flourished in his career, racking up victories and a memorable knockout in 2014 that reverberated throughout the boxing world. By 2015, he had won the WBO Latino title, defending it several times, and Puerto Ricans were speculating that he would become the boxing legacy they had long awaited. But behind the fame was a personal life rife with secrets and contradictions. Keishla Rodríguez Ortiz, also born in 1993 in San Juan, grew up in a large, modest family, known for her kindness, love of animals, and her dream of becoming a veterinarian. She has a close relationship with her sister Barriz, her soul mate, and stayed in Puerto Rico when her mother moved to Florida after her divorce. Felix and Keishla's paths have crossed since childhood. Deepening teenage friendships are not unusual in a small community. But as the world changes, their relationship becomes more murky. They move on, but Keishla remains attached, both romantically and romantically, to Felix, despite knowing he married another woman, Eliza Santiago, in 2016. The younger Eliza, a rising Instagram model, is now stepmother to Felix's only acknowledged daughter. In public, they appear perfect. Behind closed doors, Felix continues to see Keishla secretly, obsessively. When his boxing career took a nosedive after a serious motorcycle accident in 2016, Eliza confronted him. She demanded fidelity, threatened divorce, and said she would give him custody of their young daughter if he didn't end his affair. For a time, Felix pulled away. Keishla pulled back, but her grief and fear held her back. She still loved him, even as he threatened her with fame, control, and emotional terror. Then came early April 2021. Keishla discovered she was pregnant with Felix's child. She told her sister and mother, and both urged her to stand her ground. She called Felix, hoping he would finally take responsibility. Instead, he flew into a rage. He told her to terminate the pregnancy or face the consequences. When she refused, he flew into a rage. He insisted on proof, which she provided, a doctor's certificate confirming the pregnancy. They arranged to meet on the evening of April 29. Keishla knew she was in danger but remained hopeful. Barriz and their mother urged her not to go, fearing what the confrontation would entail, but their pleas were in vain. Keishla went. Driving her own dark gray Kia Forte, she arrived, carrying the certificate, a symbol of life and hope for both of them. That evening, Felix called his friend Luis Antonio Cadiz, a man with connections to the criminal underworld. He pressures Cadiz to help him fix the situation. Felix loudly offers money and insists that the authorities will never come after them. Despite their past legal troubles, Cadiz agrees. After all, their friendship has been cemented, and Felix reassures him. When Keishla gets out of the car and talks to Felix, she shows proof of life inside her. He again asks her to stop it. She cries. She refuses again. In the heated argument that follows, testimony at trial shows that Felix hit her so hard, her head fell back, her consciousness gone. As the world faded before Keishla's eyes, Felix and Cadiz complete a plan they had formulated in cold blood. A witness, the next key figure, later testifies that they injected her with a syringe filled with poison. Federal complaints and investigators described finding fentanyl and xylazine, a sedative more commonly used in veterinary medicine than in humans. In her system, the choice was terrifying, a chemical meant to end her life quietly. They bound her wrists and ankles with wire, attached a heavy cement block, then lifted her into the trunk of Keishla's car, which had been commandeered by Cadiz, and drove her to Puente Teodoro Moscoso, a large bridge spanning the San Jose Lagoon. It was still early when they arrived. The roads were sparse, the dawn light pale. In broad daylight, two men threw her, still alive, over the railing. And as her lifeless body sank, a shot was fired into the water to ensure she would never resurface. A few minutes later, the world news shifted. Keishla's car was found abandoned in Canavanas on April 29 with identification papers inside, no sign of a struggle. The very next day, May 1, a passerby spotted a silhouette in the murky waters of the lagoon. Authorities recovered a body. In that moment, hope turned to devastation. Their fears were confirmed. Postmortem dental records and a distinctive tattoo revealed the identity: Keishla Rodríguez Ortiz. The island was engulfed in disbelief and outrage. Protesters filled the streets. They carried signs reading "Ni una más," "It's not me," and "Nos queremos vivas," "It's not me." The bridge became both a crime scene and a rallying point, a symbol of unsettled grief and anger. Thousands demanded accountability. The outrage was a turning point. Media reports that had once sensationalized the details now took on a social backlash, sparking conversations about gender violence that Puerto Rico could no longer ignore. Meanwhile, law enforcement moved quickly. Surveillance cameras captured Felix's black Dodge Durango near the bridge at the time of the crime, following Keishla's Kia. His phone, as well as Keishla's and Cadiz's, pinged locations that matched the route they later described, from downtown San Juan through residential areas toward the Lagoon Bridge. Investigators linked more than 110 calls between the phones in the weeks leading up to the attack, including several on the morning of April 29. These records, combined with Felix's own driving route and Cadiz's testimony, painted a chilling picture of targeted behavior. On May 2, Felix turned himself in to authorities. He initially denied any involvement, claiming he had spent the night at home, but his legal case quickly faltered. Cameras, phone metadata, physical evidence in the car, including strands of Keishla's hair, were undermining his defense. Cadiz, on the other hand, confessed, agreeing to cooperate. He would testify in detail about the events of the case, naming Felix as the mastermind while maintaining his own freedom. Within days, a federal grand jury indicted Felix Verdejo, charging him with kidnapping resulting in death, carjacking resulting in death, causing the death of an unborn child, and using a weapon to commit these violent acts, charges that, under U.S. federal law, could carry the death penalty. What began as a rumor about jealousy and a boxer's lies had now evolved into a trial strategy and a national reckoning. As Keishla's body was pulled from the San Jose Lagoon, the island seemed to stop breathing. News channels cut to their regular broadcasts. Her name was mentioned repeatedly on social media, accompanied by hashtags calling for justice, accountability, and change. But for her family, there was no time to process the public outrage. A funeral was needed, and a truth they had suspected would have to be faced head-on. Keishla's mother, Kayla, flew in from Florida, clinging to the faint hope that there might have been a mistake. But when she saw the tattoo on her daughter's arm, she couldn't deny it. It was her daughter. She was devastated not just by the loss, but by the sheer enormity of what had happened. Keishla had trusted Felix. She had known him since she was a teenager. She believed, against all odds, that he would not harm her. That belief cost her life and that of her unborn child. The public saw it as more than just a murder. It was a symbol of everything wrong with how women are treated when they dare to stand up to powerful men. Puerto Rico has been hit hard by a spate of femicides, so much so that, in early 2021, the governor declared a state of emergency on gender-based violence. Keishla's murder added fuel to an already smoldering fire. As protesters marched, investigators began piecing together the moments before her disappearance. They started with the obvious: Felix. After all, he was the last person known to have had contact with her. And though he insisted he was home, that alibi quickly fell apart. His wife herself told police she hadn't seen him that night. Surveillance footage revealed the truth. The cameras captured his black Dodge Durango following Keishla's Kia Forte toward the bridge in the early morning. More footage showed that the Kia was not driven by Keishla, but by another man later identified as Luis Antonio Cadiz. Forensics began there. In the bed of Felix's truck, investigators found hairs that matched Keishla's DNA. Phone records confirmed the truth. Felix's phone was in the same location as Keishla's on the morning of April 29, traveling toward the lagoon. And there were the calls, more than 100 between Felix and Cadiz in the weeks leading up to the crime, plus several just hours before and after. The breakthrough came when Cadiz surrendered. Under the weight of the evidence, he agreed to cooperate in exchange for a lighter sentence. What he told them was chilling and matched what investigators had suspected. He described how Felix had planned the attack in advance. He had asked Cadiz to get drugs to inject, and he had brought steel wire and a concrete block. How they waited for Keishla in the truck and how the confrontation turned violent. The federal complaint that followed laid it all out. Keishla had been beaten, injected with a lethal drug, bound with wire, weighed down with a cement block, and thrown alive into the lagoon. The final shot fired into the water wasn't a mercy shot. It was to ensure she would never surface alive. When authorities arrested Felix on May 2, the entire island knew. He was facing some of the most serious charges possible. Kidnapping resulting in death, carjacking resulting in death, causing the death of a fetus, and using a firearm in a violent crime. Under the federal system, any of these charges could result in a death sentence. Yet even as Cadiz explained the story, Felix refused to plead guilty. He insisted he had nothing to do with Keishla's death. His legal team tried to clear him up, claiming that Cadiz had fabricated the details to save himself. But the physical evidence, the hair, the phone records, and the surveillance footage proved Cadiz was extremely detailed. And then the funeral came. On May 8, the streets of San Juan witnessed one of the most heartbreaking farewells the island had seen in years. Keishla's white coffin was brought to the cemetery not by hearse but by horse-drawn carriage. White petals fell from above, a symbolic farewell to a young woman who had lost her life too soon. Television cameras captured the moment her mother clutched the coffin, sobbing and whispering. Her sister stood by, wearing a shirt bearing Keishla's photo. Thousands of mourners gathered, not just to mourn but to make a statement: this cannot happen again. Politicians, celebrities, and athletes condemned the murder. Feminist groups seized on the tragedy to demand stronger protections for women, better enforcement of the ban, and punishment for those who threatened them. But behind the public mourning was a private pain. Keishla's mother recalled her final days, wondering if there was any way to prevent her from going to that meeting. Her sister writhed in guilt. She had warned her, but it was not enough. And all the while, the man they believed responsible stood trial, denying everything. It was hard not to notice the imbalance. Felix was a famous athlete, well-connected and wealthy. Keishla was a veterinarian devoted to her pets and her young family. One had a publicist and a lawyer. The other had a mother and sister. Yet in death, Keishla has a stronger voice than she ever had in life. For Puerto Rico, the case is a mirror image. It raises a difficult question: how many times have women's cries for help been ignored until it was too late? Keishla told her family she was being threatened. She tried to leave the relationship. She even took steps to build her own life, separate from Felix. But eventually love, fear, and their complicated past pulled her back into his orbit with deadly consequences. By the summer of 2021, the trial had begun. Delays due to the pandemic have delayed hearings, but the evidence continues to pile up. Cadiz's cooperation means prosecutors can reconstruct the timeline almost minute by minute. Forensic reports match his testimony. Phone records match his testimony. The physical condition of Keishla's body matches his testimony. For the jury, the case was no longer about whether Felix was guilty, but about how harsh his punishment should be. Federal prosecutors considered seeking the death penalty. Keishla's family, however, had other wishes. They wanted him to spend the rest of his life behind bars, facing the reality of what he had done every day until his last breath. That moral choice to reject the death penalty and ask for life in prison spoke volumes. It was not forgiveness. It was a slow, agonizing, inescapable sentence. But even with all this evidence, one question remained. How did someone go from a promising athlete to a convicted murderer? What broke inside a person to turn them into a predator toward the person they claimed to love? As the trial began, the story was already in the public eye. In Puerto Rico, people weren't asking whether Felix Verdejo was guilty. They were waiting to see what sentence the justice system was willing to impose on one of the island's former sports heroes. The federal courthouse in San Juan became the stage for this final act. Security was tight. Reporters filled the stands, pens rustled, cameras clicked as Felix was led in. He still had the demeanor of a fighter, head held high, eyes looking straight ahead, but he had lost the confidence that had once lit up the boxing arena. Every step forward now was a step toward a life he could no longer control. Prosecutors opened the trial with a clear and devastating statement. They told the jury it was a carefully calculated crime, driven by pride, control, and fear of scandal. They portrayed Felix not as a man who made a rash decision in the heat of the moment, but as someone who planned step by step to wipe out Keishla and her unborn child. They had a powerful witness, Luis Antonio Cadiz. Under oath, Cadiz stuck to the same account he had given investigators months earlier. His voice was calm but heavy as he described Felix's plea for help. It began with a conversation about solving a problem and turned into a plan for murder. He described taking the syringe, the wire, the concrete block. He recounted to the jury the grisly details of April 29, the argument in the truck, Felix beating Keishla, the injection, the tying up, and the final act on the bridge. Cadiz was unsparing in his testimony. He admitted his role, his decision to do it for the money and loyalty. The jury watched him closely, a man testifying against an old friend in exchange for leniency. The defense seized on this point immediately. Felix's lawyers, in turn, tried to discredit Cadiz. They argued that he was the real killer, fabricating the story to save himself by blaming a celebrity. They argued that the physical evidence could be interpreted in other ways, that the hair in the truck did not necessarily mean murder, that the phone records merely proved that the two men had been in contact. But the prosecution countered with hard science and hard facts. They called in forensic experts who confirmed that the hair found in Felix's truck was more than a random trace. It was consistent with a violent struggle. They showed the jury the exact route from San Juan to the bridge, reconstructed from cell phone tower data, matching Cadiz's account down to the minute. They showed surveillance footage showing the two cars in sequence, leaving little doubt as to who was behind the wheel. Then came the medical testimony. A forensic pathologist described the injuries on Keishla's body, consistent with blunt force trauma and chemical injection. A toxicology report confirmed the presence of fentanyl and xylazine, both powerful drugs capable of causing rapid unconsciousness or death. The jury saw the cold motive behind the scheme in these details. This was not an accident, it was not a loss of composure. It was intentional. Felix himself chose not to testify. He sat silently throughout the trial, sometimes leaning toward his attorney to whisper, sometimes staring at the floor as witnesses recounted the murder. His wife, now estranged, also testified that she had not seen him at home during the time he said he was there, and admitted that she had long suspected an affair with Keishla. The emotional weight of the trial was inescapable. Keishla's family attended every day, her mother clutching a photo of her daughter, her sister wearing a lock of Keishla's hair. Their faces said everything that words could not. The closing arguments made the case clear. Prosecutors reminded the jury that Keishla was a living, breathing person, a daughter, a sister, a friend who dared to hold her child and tell the truth. And for that she was bound, drugged, and thrown into the lagoon as if she were a piece of trash. The defense urged the jury to question the motives of the government's star witness. They argued that Cadiz had manipulated her testimony to lessen her own sentence. But by then, the weight of the physical evidence combined with the precise timeline and expert testimony made it nearly impossible to pin the blame on Felix. The jury had been deliberating for hours, not days. When they returned, the courtroom was silent. The foreman stood up and read the verdicts one by one. Guilty of kidnapping resulting in death. Guilty of carjacking resulting in death. Guilty of causing the death of a fetus. Guilty of using a firearm in a crime of violence. Each word hung heavy in the air. Felix sat motionless, staring ahead, reality settling in. Cadiz was also found guilty, but his cooperation ensured a different sentencing process. The verdict hit the public like a thunderbolt. Outside the courthouse, the crowd chanted Justicia para Keishla and Ni una más. Some cried, others raised their fists in silent solidarity. For Keishla's family, it was a bittersweet victory. No conviction, no sentence could bring her back, but the admission of guilt was important. It told the world that her life mattered, that the murder would not be overlooked just because her killer was famous. Now came the question of punishment. Under federal law, the crime could have carried the death penalty. But Keishla's family was adamant they wanted him to live, to spend each day behind bars with a clear understanding of what he had done. They believed that death would be too easy, that a slow life in prison was a truer form of justice. The judge set a sentencing date. Meanwhile, the case has left a deep mark on Puerto Rican society. It has become a rallying cry for activists, a talking point in political debates, and a reminder that fame is no shield against accountability. But it has also raised a deeper, more difficult question to answer. How many other women's stories have ended in silence because no one listened in time? Keishla's name has become a succinct reminder of that. When the verdict came, it did not close the story. It even opened a new chapter, one in which Puerto Rico had to ponder what Keishla's case really meant. In the months that followed, the federal court prepared to hand down its sentence. Prosecutors could have asked for the death penalty. The evidence was there. The brutality of the crime on a pregnant woman done on purpose fitted the criteria. But the family's position never wavered: life without parole. For them, it wasn't about revenge. It was about ensuring Felix Verdejo lived every day in prison, stripping him of the fame, fortune, and public admiration that had come to define him. It was about making him live with the knowledge of what he had done. When sentencing day arrived, the courtroom had a different feel than the courtroom. The air was heavy with emotion, but also with a certain resignation. The judge read the charges again, each one carrying an immeasurable weight. And then, he pronounced the sentence: life in federal prison, without the possibility of parole. It was exactly what Keishla's family wanted. There would be no pleas for freedom, no early release. The once promising boxer who had given Puerto Rico Olympic hopes would die behind bars. Luis Antonio Cadiz, whose testimony helped cement the conviction, faced his own fate. His cooperation helped him secure a lighter sentence. But the years that followed were a reminder that his role had also ruined the lives of others. Outside the courthouse, the mood was bittersweet. Activists held signs and chanted Keishla's name. Some hugged and cried, others stood silently. The victory was real, but it came at a high price. In the weeks since the verdict, Keishla's family has begun to speak more openly about her life, not just her death. They shared photos of her with her beloved pets, videos of her laughing with her sister, stories of her quiet devotion to her work at the veterinary clinic. They wanted the world to remember her not just as a victim, but as a whole person with a life worth living. Puerto Rican media re-examined the timeline of her relationship with Felix, highlighting the red flags, the threats, the attempts to control her, the vicious cycles of breakups and reconciliations. Domestic violence experts pointed to the prevalence of these behaviors and how often they escalated into fatal violence. Her murder became a rallying point for a broader discussion. In public squares and on social media, people began to ask difficult questions. Why do so many women feel helpless when a relationship becomes dangerous? Why are bans, even when they are in place, often ignored or not enforced? Why is gender-based violence still seen as an individual tragedy rather than a systemic crisis? The responses were jarring. Puerto Rico was in the midst of a state of emergency over femicide. Keishla's case demonstrated that even high-profile victims could be overlooked. If this had happened to her, a woman whose family was willing to speak out, whose killer was a public figure, what chance did others have? Grassroots organizations seized the moment. They held vigils, marches, and conferences. They pressed lawmakers to strengthen victim protections, increase funding for shelters, and train police to handle domestic violence more effectively. Keishla's name added to the list of women whose deaths had forced the island to take a hard look at itself. Her story was echoed in speeches, printed on protest signs, and whispered in warning moments between friends. Be careful. Remember what happened to her. For her family, life will never be normal again. Her sister, once her closest confidant, struggles with guilt, recalling every warning, every conversation, wondering if there was anything more she could have said or done. Her mother carries a dull ache, one that no sentence, no movement, no public cry can erase. But they also carry a determination. In interviews, they speak not only of their grief, but also of their hope that Keishla's death will save others. That by telling her story loudly and repeatedly, they might motivate others to leave dangerous situations before it's too late. And somewhere in federal prison, a man who once believed himself untouchable now wakes up every morning to the sound of his cell door slamming shut. A daily reminder that no amount of talent, no amount of fame can erase the truth of what he did. Keishla's legacy lies not in the brutality of her death, but in the power of the voices that have emerged since. In the marches that continue to take place on the streets of San Juan. In the demands for accountability that grow louder with each passing day. Her story has become a warning, a call to action, and a promise that those who harm will face justice and those who are silenced will be heard. And for those who loved her, there is one more truth. Although Keishla Rodríguez Ortiz is gone too soon, she will never be forgotten.